Born January 15, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was one of the most prominent civil rights leaders of our time. Dr. King led the charge of fighting legalized racism through many acts of nonviolent resistance and civil disobedience. He led several monumental marches, boycotts, and gave powerful speeches against the unfair treatment of African Americans beginning in 1955. He was also the first president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, also known as the SCLC. On January 2, 1965, Dr. King and the SCLC joined a voting rights campaign in Selma along with multiple other civil rights activist organizations. They decided on Selma because of law enforcement's reputation of brutality against African Americans there in hopes that it would pressure Congress to enact new voting rights legislation. Meanwhile, 48 miles away on a small peninsula, surrounded on three sides by the Alabama River, the residents of Gee's Bend, Alabama had been actively protesting, marching, and being brutalized for their rights to vote. By 1962, the Gee's Bend ferry was taken away to prevent them from participating in the civil rights movement. The ferry was the residents' only way to get to Camden, and as they were an isolated, self-sufficient community, their only link to the outside world, the residents continued to find a way to Camden to fight for their right to vote even in the face of violence, incarceration, and sometimes even death. On February 16, 1965, Dr. King spoke at Pleasant Grove Baptist Church in Gee's Bend, Alabama, encouraging the residents to continue to fight for their rights.
Opportunities that many other people have. But I want you to know that you are somebody and you are as good as any white person in Wilcox County. You got to believe that.
It gave me hope for my children that they can finish high school and they can go places and be a doctor, be a teacher.
He said that we was eligible to become registered voters, and we was eligible to drink the same water the white people were drinking. And he said if we live long enough, we would be here to see little white boys, black boys and girls walk together.
The women of Gee's Bend by this time had been quilting out of necessity for many generations. The women would go on to found the Freedom Quilting Bee, with Dr. King being one of the first benefactors, leading to them naming their sewing center after him. The Freedom Quilting Bee provided the women of the community their first opportunity for financial freedom and was a means of protest in itself. Today, the quilters of Gee's Bend are world-renowned and have both temporary and permanent collections in museums all over the world. On January 18th, Dr. King is savagely attacked by Jimmy Robinson, a member of the racist group States' Rights Party, while attempting to check into the previously segregated Albert Hotel in Selma. On February 18, 1965, Jimmy Lee Jackson of Marion, Alabama, was shot trying to stop his mother from being assaulted by police. Jimmy Lee would succumb to his injuries 8 days later. On March 7th, activists from Marion and Selma, led by Hosea Williams and John Lewis, set out on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in hopes of marching to the state capitol in Montgomery, Alabama. The protesters' path was blocked by local officials and state troopers, who attacked the protesters with tear gas and billy clubs when they didn't disperse as ordered. The march was later coined Bloody Sunday. It was so brutal. Dr. King, who was in Atlanta at the time, began a campaign to redo the march a couple days later. Federal Court Judge Frank Johnson informed the movement's lawyer of a restraining order they intended to file blocking the march, and President Johnson urged them to postpone until he could offer protection to the protesters. Despite this, on March 9, 1965, Dr. King led over 2,000 protesters, including residents of Gee's Bend and hundreds of clergy that had been gathered by Dr. King after Bloody Sunday. The protesters knelt and prayed at the site where Bloody Sunday took place, and to avoid another confrontation with officials, turned around and headed back to Selma, leading to criticism from activists but support from President Johnson, who promised to introduce a new rights bill to Congress. That night, a white protester named James Reeb from Massachusetts was attacked by local racists, causing national outrage once again and leading to President Johnson urging Alabama's governor to protect the protesters. On March 15th, President Johnson approached Congress for the first time and aligned himself with protesters. On March 16th, the protesters submitted a march plan to Judge Johnson, who not only approved it, but ordered the governor and law enforcement not to harass or threaten them. On March 21st, protected by FBI agents and the National Guard, the federally sanctioned march began, and over the next 4 days, demonstrators marched during the day and camped in supporters' yards at night. The protesters marched for up to 17 miles per day, and with the marchers swelling from 300 to almost 25,000 by the last night. After the march, a petition from the protesters to Governor Wallace was blocked, and while protesters were being ferried back to Selma, a white housewife from Michigan named Viola Luiso was murdered by 4 Ku Klux Klan members, 3 of which were later prosecuted for violating her civil rights. On August 6, 1965, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Dr. King would go on to lead the Chicago Campaign and the Poor People's Campaign, in which he campaigned for economic equality, and the International Peace Campaign, in which he spoke out against the Vietnam War. Dr. King gave very many speeches over the years and during these times. He was assassinated April 4, 1968 in Memphis. As impressed as the residents of Gee's Bend thought they were of Dr. King, he was just as impressed with them. His family commissioned the mules to carry his casket from Gee's Bend. As I embark on this Pettway History Month with you, it is only fitting that I begin by honoring the hero who led the charge for our equality on this day of his birth. Over the next couple of months, I will take you on a journey with me to get to know my family. You see, my family is famous. My family is famous for being self-sufficient and black in a time when black people weren't supposed to be self-sufficient. And though the infamous Dr. King is not bound to us by DNA, we do in fact consider him one of our ancestors. That is why I begin with his story and how it ties into ours. Join me as I introduce you to the quilters of Gee's Bend.